Hello, everyone. I hope that you are having a wonderful afternoon here. This is EFMN's Seizure Triggers 101 webinar. So before we get started with the content here, I do want to go over some housekeeping items. This is going to be an hour-long training, and as far as bandwidth goes, if you have any applications in the background like Pandora or Spotify, YouTube, things like that that play video or use a lot of data, please have those shut down. That can affect the way that this webinar runs. So just to have the best experience, that should be shut down. This does not qualify, so this training does not qualify for a CEU, but we do have many other options if you want to learn about that. Please contact me. And if you do want a certificate of completion, you can contact me as well. This is also being recorded, so if you would like a recording, you can reach out. Before we get started, I want to do a quick disclaimer that the information shared in this PowerPoint is to inform you on aspects of seizure triggers. However, all potential treatment options need to be discussed with your doctor or physician. And all of the references used in this PowerPoint presentation is found at the end of the presentation, and you can find those links there. And then if you are having any tech issues, I have a question and answers area that you can put any potential questions. We are monitoring that, but we do not have any tech capabilities necessarily on our end. So please contact Zoom if you're having anything major happening with your tech. And then in regards to those questions, you can find the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen, the way it looks on your screen here. You just press that Q&A and you can enter your questions and then press send. Again, you can use that for that tech area. I'm not going to be taking questions until the end of the presentation, but feel free to put it in there at any time. We do have somebody who's monitoring that. And so you can use that to kind of track your questions. Oh, and then another note is that chat is disabled. My name is Jamila Pickett. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Education at the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota. My main duties are providing educational programming throughout Minnesota and Eastern North Dakota. You can contact me by email or call me. I'll get back to you within 3 business days. My email is jpickett@efmn.org, or you can call me at 651-287-2315. But please leave a voicemail because I am not working in office currently. Today's objectives are we are going to define what epilepsy and seizures are. We're going to learn about what seizure triggers are, and we're also going to identify what a seizure trigger can be. This will increase knowledge of available treatment outcomes. All right, so I have a poll that I'm going to be sharing here for everyone to be a part of. So I'll launch this poll here, and it's how much do you know about seizure triggers? So you can either choose nothing at all, I don't know what I know what they are, but I want to learn more, or I know a little bit about seizure triggers. And I'll give people a second here to put in their answers before I go on here. And it looks like we have 100% participation. So let me end the poll here, and let's share those results. So it looks like about 50% of you know what they are, but you want to learn more, which is awesome. And then the other half knows a little bit about seizure triggers, which is great because we're going to take the beginning of this presentation to just go over some of those seizure and epilepsy basics before we actually get into that trigger content. So we do have a really good base to kind of work off of. All right. So the first piece of content that we'll be going over today is just going to be a bit of review. If you know a lot about epilepsy or you already know a lot about seizures, then a lot of this information will just be repeated or again, review for you. But for someone who maybe doesn't know a lot about epilepsy or seizures, this is kind of imperative for you to know to really understand what seizure triggers are. So epilepsy is a very prevalent condition across the globe. According to the World Health Organization, about 50 million people around the world do have epilepsy. The CDC says that 1.2% of the population has epilepsy in the United States. So that's about 470,000 children and nearly 1 million people over the age of 55. 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime, and there's not really a common denominator there. So when we are thinking about that 1 in 26 number, that is through age, geography, race, etc. Anybody can develop epilepsy at any time. About 1 in 10 people will have a seizure at some point in their lifetime, and you do not need to have a seizure condition to fall into that statistic. We all have a seizure threshold, and so we all can have a seizure, and so that 1 in 10 of us will or have had a seizure already in our life. And something a little bit visual that I like to talk about is classroom sizes. So even if you're not necessarily related or work in a school setting, about the average class size is about 30 to 31 students. So when we're thinking about a school, about one child in every other classroom has epilepsy or will develop epilepsy. So that gives us a really good base to kind of think about where or how many people have epilepsy in the United States. So of course, when we're talking about epilepsy, we want to talk about what epilepsy is. So epilepsy is a neurological condition that causes reoccurring seizures, and these seizures are unprovoked. They also come from a person's brain. The reason why we want to make sure that we qualify these things is because there are other seizure conditions. So epilepsy is just one of many seizure conditions. And people can have a seizure for a lot of different reasons outside of having a seizure condition. But for it to be epilepsy, it has to happen more than once in a person's lifetime, and it has to come from a person's brain. And these seizures are unprovoked. Some people may call their epilepsy seizure disorder or seizure condition. I would take that with a grain of salt because the term seizure disorder or seizure condition is more of an umbrella term that a lot of other conditions can fall under. So it's not wrong to call your epilepsy seizure disorder or seizure condition, but just remember that if somebody says that, they may not necessarily have epilepsy. So what is a seizure? Well, the seizure is the symptom of epilepsy. On your screen, you see different parts of the brain lighting up. This is to signify that they are in charge of different functions in our body. Throughout these different parts, we have what are called pathways, and on these pathways are the electrical signals that I talked about earlier. They work together with the pathways and the parts of your brain to kind of tell us what to do throughout the day. What can happen when somebody's having a seizure associated with epilepsy is that these neurons can get sent when they're not supposed to. That's called a misfiring, and that's what can change a person's awareness, sensation, movement, and that is what the seizure is visualized in that person. Depending on what part of the brain is being affected by that misfiring activity, that is what the seizure is going to look like. So let's say the part of the brain that deals with sense of smell is being affected by the misfiring, then this person's seizure might be smelling things that are not actually there. Perhaps it's happening in the occipital lobe where it deals with things like eyesight, that maybe they're seeing something that's not actually there. Something more stereotypic when people think about epilepsy and seizures is maybe the entire brain is being affected by that misfiring activity, then this person may be having entire body convulsions. About 10 years ago, if you asked somebody how many seizure types there were, they maybe would have said 20. Now we're constantly breaking down categories and building them up, but as of right now, we know of 40 plus seizure types. So one person's seizure type might look completely different than another person's seizure type. Of these types, they're broken down into one of these three classifications. We have the focal onset. This used to be known as partial, generalized onset, and then the unknown onset. When we're thinking about onset, that piece is really referring to the part of the brain that the misfiring is starting from. So if somebody is having a focal onset seizure, that means that a focused area of the brain is being affected by that misfiring activity, or just one part or one portion. Depending on what part of the brain is being affected, this person may be completely aware during their seizure, or they may have impaired awareness. Then we have generalized seizures. People who have these seizures always have some sort of impaired awareness because their entire brain is being affected by misfiring. And then lastly, we have the unknown onset. This category is not necessarily individuals that are not having focal or generalized seizures, but it is very descriptive in its language that it's unknown. Many people get a preliminary diagnosis of epilepsy, but they're not sure if they're having focal or generalized seizures, and that might be why they're in that category. Unfortunately, 50 to 60% of epilepsy cases have an unknown cause, but of the known causes, head trauma or brain injury is the number one known cause. So we have some examples on the screen here, such as head injury, brain infection, brain injuries, brain lesions, things like that. It would be impossible to put on a list every single thing that can cause epilepsy, but a good rule of thumb is anything that can cause injury to a person's head or brain can cause epilepsy. All right, so we really got through that review there. That's just that background information, that base information that we should know about when we're talking about epilepsy, just so we have a better understanding of what seizure triggers are. So now we're going to move into that content around seizure triggers. So what is a seizure trigger? The way that we have it on the screen here is a thing or event that may cause someone to have a seizure. It's really hard to describe to an individual what a seizure trigger is without talking about that specific trigger, because a trigger could be so many things. Sometimes a seizure trigger is really tangible, and other times a seizure trigger is something that you might see or hear. Basically, a seizure trigger is something that can happen to you or around you, or maybe something that you do that can cause you to have that misfiring in your brain that results in that seizure that you have. Not everybody with epilepsy has a seizure trigger, and every seizure does not have a trigger. Sometimes it just happens. So even though you know that you have a seizure trigger, that doesn't mean that every single time you have a seizure, it's associated with a trigger. It can just happen randomly a lot of times. And also, just because you have one seizure trigger does not mean you have another one. And just because you have a seizure trigger doesn't mean that you can't have other seizure triggers. So it is very intricate in a lot of ways because it's not straightforward. Everybody's seizure triggers are different, and people have seizure triggers for different reasons. Some individuals notice patterns or that their seizures only happen during certain situations, and that's one base way to tell if something is a seizure trigger. For some individuals, every single time something happens that's associated with their trigger, they will have a seizure. That may be a reflex epilepsy, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in this presentation. For other individuals, perhaps they need to have triggers kind of build up on each other before they have their seizure. Again, that's something we'll talk a little bit more about later on in this PowerPoint. The reason, though, that I do like to talk about this part is because we want to be careful we're not making false associations. There's a video clip that I used to play that the man basically said every time he would see his mother-in-law, he would have a seizure. And so his mother-in-law must have been his seizure trigger. But in reality, he might have just been stressed out when he saw his mother-in-law. And stress is a trigger for some people. And maybe that's why he was having that seizure. So we want to be careful of false associations. And we also want to be careful of assigning things to every single seizure, because again, a lot of seizures just happen. As I mentioned before, everyone has a seizure threshold that is determined partially by our heredity, so our parents, and we get pushed past that threshold, and that results in somebody having a seizure. Some potential seizure triggers include missed or late medication, stress and anxiety, lack of sleep and fatigue, hormonal changes. So when I'm talking about hormonal changes, we have menstrual cycle as an example. There are other examples such as puberty. Maybe you're an older adult going through changes. Throughout the month, people's hormones change quite a bit. So that could be a time in itself. Maybe a person is pregnant. So there are a lot of times throughout the month that people's hormone levels do change. Another potential trigger is alcohol or recreational drugs, other drug interactions, overheating or dehydration, poor diet or missed meals, and then photosensitivity. So triggers are not exclusive to epilepsy. There are a lot of conditions that have triggers. And so if something happens to a person or something happens around them, that might trigger something in their medical condition. And when we're thinking about those seizure triggers, it's important to remember it's not going to be limited to a list. There is no way that I could send you a list of all the seizure triggers, because there are so many things that can trigger a seizure, and there are a lot of things that people might not even realize can be a seizure trigger as well. So this is, again, a limited list, and I'll be going over some key trigger topics, but definitely if you have any questions about other triggers, please put that in the questions area. All right, so before we move on here, I'm gonna launch another poll. And it is, what is a seizure trigger? So the first one is a type of epilepsy. Second is something people wear. And the last one is a thing or event that may cause someone to have a seizure. And I'll give it a little bit of time for the last few remaining people to vote here. So this is what you should have learned from the first few slides here. Awesome. It looks like everyone has put in their response. So let me end that poll and then I'll share those results. So it sounds like everyone is listening. So a seizure trigger is a thing or event that may cause someone to have a seizure. All right. The first seizure trigger we're going to go over in depth is missed or late medication. So this is actually the most common seizure trigger, and this is a pretty tangible one. So with these tangible seizure triggers, there are some benefits of knowing that, hey, if I don't take my medicine, or if I take it way after the time that I'm supposed to take it, then I might have a seizure. Whereas with some of these triggers, you might not necessarily know when it's going to happen, or there's no way for you to minimize the effects of it. So missing medication can result in having a seizure. And also for some medications, you strictly have to take that medication around or at a specific time for it to work correctly. And so if you miss it or you don't take it at that time, it could have an effect on your seizure control. Now, we're all human, and it wouldn't be fair to tell people, hey, don't ever miss your medication ever. That's horrible. You can't do that. I mean, that's not right. We're all human. We forget things and it happens. So what we should try to do is just try not to make it a habit. Maybe put things in place so that it doesn't happen often and try to avoid it. And that's really all we can do, um, because it is something that anybody can legitimately accidentally forget, or there are also a number of other reasons why a person might miss their medication. This can be a trigger even if you usually take your medication and you usually don't miss it. Just because you take it on time every single time and you miss it once doesn't mean that you won't have a seizure. And this is because there are sudden changes of medication levels in your blood, and that can result in you having a seizure. It's very all of a sudden, and it can be kind of shocking to your system. Though there are a lot of reasons why a person can have a seizure from missed or late medication. If you do miss your medication, do not just double dose. Don't double dose. Call your doctor and ask them what you should be doing specifically. They will have recommendations specifically for you and the medications that you are taking. So how do we avoid missing our medications? So setting alarms and reminders can be really helpful. You can do this on your phone now or by an alarm clock. Creating a schedule also can be helpful. I'm definitely more of a written person, so I like to write down my schedules and things like that. But if you are better with technology, you can also go that way. Using a pill box with the days of the week also can be helpful. And you can actually use those first 3 bullet points combined. Maybe you're setting an alarm to create your schedule, or you use a schedule and your alarm to remember to use your pill box that has the days of the week on it. And it's going to create a repetitive practice that hopefully eventually it'll be second nature and you just remember you have to do that. Another way to avoid missing your medications is having your prescriptions pre-filled by your pharmacist if that's possible, and keeping a 1-week emergency supply if that's possible as well. So if you have the combination of having it pre-filled and you have an emergency 1-week supply, that should minimize reasons why you would have to miss your medication. Sometimes it's not a matter of remembering to take your medication, but perhaps the administration or when you have to take it is a bit intricate. Maybe you can talk to your doctor about other treatment or regimen options. Maybe this is the best one for you, but sometimes there are other options or ways that you can use that medication that might be easier for your lifestyle. You can also contact your local epilepsy foundation to learn about assistance programs. We all know that the only reason for avoiding and missing medication is not just because we forget. Sometimes people just do not have the resources. Perhaps it's financial, perhaps you really just physically can't get to the pharmacy. So please reach out to your local epilepsy foundation for resources. And you may also want to meet with a social worker or counselor, and they can help you as well. All right, so now we're going to be going over stress and anxiety. So this is another very, very common seizure trigger. Though missed and late medication is the #1 seizure trigger, stress and anxiety is the most commonly reported seizure trigger. So I usually say this is the #1 outside of missed and late medication. This one is not as tangible as missing your medication because stress can be a lot of things for a lot of people. Stress for one person can be different from another person, and you don't necessarily know when a stressful situation is going to be coming your way. Stress reduction may not reduce seizures, but avoidance of stressors can. So what that bullet point really means is that we don't have any evidence or data that says that reducing your stress when it's happening will prevent you from having a seizure. That's not to say that you shouldn't try, because we also don't have evidence that says it doesn't work. We just don't have enough to say to recommend people to do that. What we can say though is that if you avoid a stressor altogether and don't have that stress from the beginning, then it can't cause you to have a seizure. So if you're able to avoid it, try to do that. Stress can make certain hormones in your body be released. So that might be one reason why some people do have that as a trigger. Perhaps every time they are stressed out, they release a specific type of hormone that can affect their seizure regulation. For other people, it can be the part of the brain that's being affected. So a few slides back, I talked about seizure types and classifications. The reason why I brought that up is because classification talks about focal seizures. A focused area of the brain is being affected by misfiring activity. And so let's say that part of the brain that is associated with your seizures also is working when it's dealing with stress as a coping mechanism, or maybe just trying to problem solve. Perhaps that can cause someone to have a seizure. Now, these are just two options or two different things that may be the reason why stress and anxiety causes people to have seizures sometimes. But at the same time, this is again a very it's not a tangible trigger. So there's a lot of reasons why this may be the case. So the next slide here, and let me make sure I'm sharing my sound, is a clip from a short video. It's a very short clip talking about seizure triggers. It talks a little bit about stress, but it also talks about building up of stressors and other triggers and how that can push somebody over their seizure threshold.
Used to try to explain why stress doesn't always trigger a seizure, or why some things that can be seizure triggers don't always trigger one. So if you look here, this line is the seizure threshold line. The blue line is the seizure tendency line. So when things that increase the likelihood of seizures happen, that blue line gets up closer to the black line. So for example, if somebody with seizures drinks excessive alcohol, their tendency may go up, but if they don't drink enough, they may not have a seizure if it doesn't hit that black line. But in this situation, if there's a lot of stress, if they drank alcohol, maybe even missed a medication, and the blue line gets up this high, then a seizure might happen. This complicates our understanding and our study of stress, because not every stressful event will trigger a seizure, and the same stressful event that happens 2 or 3 different times may only trigger a seizure one time and not the other 2 times.
So from that clip there, it really talks about that seizure threshold and seizure tendency. So that constant line there that we see is the seizure threshold that I talked about that we all have. And for any person, there are things that can push people past that threshold. We all have our levels of our own threshold. Then we have the seizure tendency. For what we see on this line here, so that blue line, it looks like this individual doesn't have a trigger that necessarily will cause them to have a seizure right away once they are exposed to that trigger. What it looks like is this person has to kind of have a few triggers kind of build up until they get pushed past their threshold, and then they have a seizure. This is not true of every single person with a seizure trigger. So just remember that for some individuals, all it takes is for them to be exposed to that trigger and they will have a seizure, and they don't necessarily have to be built up or pushed past their threshold. All right, so preventing stress and seizures. There are a lot of ways that people practice stress reduction and de-stressing and meditating and things like that. So if you could lower your stress levels in the first place and lower the stressors in your life, that can be really helpful if you do know that you have a stress trigger. Proper documentation is going to be something that you're going to hear me say over and over again in this presentation. And that's because not only does it help with seizure triggers, but it actually can help with a lot of other aspects of your seizure condition or epilepsy. It can help with maintaining your medications. It can help you understand medication side effects. And it can just also make sure that you are maintaining and managing your seizures in the most productive way possible. This documentation can be used to talk to your physician or neurologist or epileptologist. So keeping a diary or a log can be really helpful. We do at EFMN have observation records that you can use as a diary, or you can just use a regular notebook. Not only can documenting these things be a form of stress reduction in itself, but you can also talk to your doctor or physician about some of the things that you're noticing. Or you can look at that by yourself and say, hey, I notice that every time this happens, I get stressed out. Or during this time of the day, if I'm here, this stressful thing happens. And so let me figure out how I can avoid that. And that moves into that second bullet point. Avoid stressful situations. Now that sounds really obvious, but it can be hard sometimes, right? Oh, what will they think if I don't show up? Or oh, I haven't seen her in a really long time. I'll feel bad if I don't go, but she's going to stress me out, etc. It happens. Maybe you can find another way to try to accommodate that event that's stressful. Perhaps if you went there physically, it might be stressful, but maybe you can talk to this person over the phone or FaceTime, especially with the type of climate we're in right now. It is appropriate to FaceTime somebody or to call them over the phone, overseeing them in person. And people should be understanding of that. Take care of yourself outside of your stressors. So overall health is very important for any person, and including a person with seizure conditions. Mediate situations when you can. This is not going to always be possible, but it can minimize or completely take away a stressor if you're able to mediate that situation. Try to relax when possible and limit extended naps. I know that I'm really bad at this. When I lay down, I need to sleep for a long period of time. I totally understand that. But it's good to try to practice keeping your naps at a smaller interval. So 20 or 30-minute naps, not a 4-hour nap. It can make a person feel groggy, and it can also really mess up your sleep cycle and your sleep pattern. So try to make your naps shorter. Follow routines. These routines can avoid those stressors or unpredictable things that can happen that can cause you to be stressed out, and set your priorities. So if you have a bill that's due in a few weeks or a paper that's due in a few weeks, maybe you have something that has to get done for work, try to be proactive and plan those things out so that you're not butting heads with that deadline. That can be really stressful for a person. And then lastly is sometimes we need extra support. Seek help if needed. Again, EFMN or your local epilepsy foundation is a great resource, or you may want to talk to your doctor about other resources that you can look into. Another trigger I want to go into is sleep. So certain times of the day can be a trigger. And when we're talking about sleep in general, it doesn't just have to be that I'm fatigued or that I had a bad night's rest. It can be that a person is fatigued. Perhaps they have more seizures in the morning or at night. Maybe a person has more seizures when they sleep. For some people, the quality of their sleep can make a difference. So sleep deprivation can cause a seizure, not getting enough sleep can, not getting quality sleep can, and then your eating habits can affect your sleep as well. It can be the things that you're eating. So some of those fattier foods, maybe fried foods, things like that, can cause stomach aches and other things that can make it difficult for you to sleep, or it can just affect your sleep in general. Eating before you go to sleep also can make it difficult for some people to have a really good, restful night of sleep. For some, seizure activity is increased during their sleeping as well, and you want to plan around that. Another thing is that for some individuals, especially children, around the time that they usually wake up or around the time that they usually go to sleep, they may have increased seizure activity. And maybe for the rest of the day, they have little or no seizure activity at all. So ways you can improve your sleep are things like getting regular exercise and just taking care of yourself altogether. You want to keep activities in the bed limited to things like sleep and sex. And the reason why is because we don't want to associate our bed with eating breakfast or watching TV. We want it to be a place that when I go there, I know it's for sleeping. And your body will, make a response to this when you are in the bed. So if you are doing a lot of different activities, your body may not associate that area for sleeping specifically. Have a positive sleep environment when possible. Again, a lot of these things sometimes we just can't control, but when we can, it can make a huge difference. Perhaps you like your room a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler when you go to sleep. Make sure to change those temperatures. Maybe have your bedding in a certain way that makes you feel comfortable. And keep it dark in your room so that you don't have glaring lights or unhealthy lights in your room while you're trying to sleep. Have a consistent sleep time because this is something that can greatly help you regulate your sleep pattern, going to sleep around the same time and waking up around the same time every day. It can make you feel better during the day as well. I know a lot of us have a lot of unpredictable schedules, but if you could at least even have a time window of when you would like to go to sleep and when you would like to wake up, at least that you're getting some consistency in there. Stay off of electronics before you go to bed and avoid caffeine as well. That can affect our sleeping. Some people enjoy warm showers before they go to bed. And I do note that you don't want to do anything stimulating before you go to bed as well. That can get adrenaline pumping. And for some people, you just feel energized. If you feel energized, why would you want to go to sleep or how could you go to sleep? Meditation helps for some. And you may want to talk to your doctor about other options. Some people can use an over-the-counter sleep aid. Most over-the-counter sleep aids do not have negative reactions with epilepsy medication. But before you do get on these medications, do talk to your doctor about your specific needs and medications. All right, so before we get into the next topic, I do want to go over this type of epilepsy. It's called a reflex epilepsy. And the reason why I want to talk about this first is because we do want a bit of a basis before we talk about the next seizure trigger. So it consists of seizures caused by specific triggers. It is not a common type of epilepsy, and some common reflex triggers include photosensitivity, reading, and noises. So you may recognize that photosensitivity, that's the flashing lights and strobe lights, things like that. So a reflex epilepsy, to put it simply, we just saw a clip where they talked about being kind of pushed by triggers over your seizure threshold. If you have a reflex epilepsy, whatever triggers that seizure will trigger the seizure when it happens, when that trigger happens. So it's not going to be something that's building on each other or is built up. It happens when they are exposed to that trigger. So the reflex epilepsy or a reflex epilepsy that I do want to talk about, a common trigger is photosensitivity. So this is commonly associated with flashing and strobe lights, but it isn't limited to that. So it can be light from the sun, it can be the regular fluorescent lights you have in your home. About 3% of people with epilepsy have a photosensitivity trigger, but you do not have to have epilepsy to be photosensitive. So being sensitive to lights pretty much. There are a lot of conditions that are associated with photosensitivity, and there are also just human things in general that are associated with photosensitivity. Perhaps you have a headache more when you're exposed to certain lights, or I know for me, I took a 23andMe test a while back, and there was something that said something around the lines of how likely you are to sneeze if you're in direct sunlight. Now it said I'm less likely, but I know for a fact that when I'm in direct sunlight, I sneeze quite a bit. But again, that's that photosensitivity piece. It's also important to note that photosensitivity is not always a reflex trigger. So for some people, it can build on itself, that you're exposed to this light and then you are really stressed out and you drank some alcohol and then you got stressed out again and then you get pushed past your trigger. That can happen with this as well, but for some it is a reflex trigger. Now, when we're thinking about the type of lights, as I said, it doesn't have to be just that flashing light or strobe lights. It can be light from the sun or regular lights that you see in your home. A story I like to tell is how a family moved their child from one bedroom in their home to another bedroom, and they just noticed that she would have seizures all of a sudden, much more than she usually would at night. And they kind of hunkered down and they observed her over one night. And what they realized is they have a pond in their backyard and her window faces the pond. And at night, the moon's light would bounce off of the pond and it would make shapes and lights on her wall. So there was an isolated light source while she was in bed and she would wake up and look at these lights. She had a photosensitivity trigger, and so that would cause her to have seizures. So it can really vary from person to person. So some tips for avoiding a photosensitivity trigger is, of course, avoid that exposure to those lights, but we can't always do that. So there are some other things that you can do as well. If you can cover one eye and turn away from the light source, that will help. And if you can leave the room or the area where that trigger is, that would be best. Don't just try to turn away from the light or that light source. It won't work the same way as covering one eye. We can still see things in our periphery, and if we're in the same room as that light source, it can still cause somebody to have a seizure even if they turn around or move away. So cover one eye and turn around and try to get out of that area. Watch television in a well-lit room. I talk to movie theater owners quite a bit, and I had one movie theater that told me that every week they had a seizure, and I wasn't surprised. And that's because when you go to the movies, you go into this dark room with an isolated light source. Regardless of what you're watching, that can mimic flashing in a dark room. So watch television in a well-lit room, and that can be very helpful. When you're watching TV or playing video games, take breaks. If you can get your hands on a flicker-free monitor online or maybe at some stores, that also can be helpful. And on some of the smartphones, you have applications where as you scroll down the screen, they might automatically play videos. For some people, this can trigger their seizures, so disable that autoplay of videos on your smartphone if you are having that issue. And then another question I get quite a bit in regards to photosensitivity is the placement of fire alarms. So by law, fire alarms not only have to make that noise so that people can hear it, but it also has to flash a light just in case there are individuals who cannot hear the alarm. And this is needed. We want to make sure that everybody is aware that they need to get somewhere safe. But there are some concerns for individuals that have photosensitivity. One thing I would note is if you are working with somebody or you yourself don't have a history of photosensitivity, you may not need to worry about this when a fire alarm is going off. But if you do know this person has photosensitivity or you just want to make an overall plan, one thing that should be noted is that the Epilepsy Foundation National does have a professional advisory board that has put together recommendations on how fire alarms should be placed and at what levels. So 2 hertz with breaks periodically is what is recommended. And maybe you'll find out that that's what your location already has. But just keep that in mind if you do have any power over that or you are concerned about at your location what happens if somebody has this photosensitivity trigger. Maybe you want to check in to make sure that the fire alarms at your location have those settings. Ways to identify a trigger, as I said before, keep that seizure diary or documentation of your seizures in some way. You want to include the time of day that it happened, what happened and how you felt when all of those things happened as well. You may look back and be able to problem solve and figure out a lot of things by yourself. But another thing is you want to talk to your doctor and you want to show your doctor these things that you document. Your physician, neurologist or epileptologist, wherever your preference or you go to, may have a lot of experience with people that have similar conditions as you, or maybe has some advice about things you can do to reduce triggers or test things out. So definitely talk to your doctor if you feel like you have any questions around that. And if you notice something is happening consistently, that may be a sign that it is a trigger. So in regards to that consistent observation piece, I pulled this quote from Epilepsy National, and I really think that it's a good example of what you should think about when you're trying to figure out if something is a trigger. For example, you noted that you were sleep deprived before 2 out of the 3 seizures in the past 3 months. But when you look at your sleep patterns, you didn't have seizures all the other times you were sleep deprived, and you don't sleep well most of the time. In this situation, sleep deprivation isn't good for you, but probably doesn't trigger seizures all by itself. You still need to work on improving your sleep, but there may be other things going on too. So for this individual, it sounds like maybe sleep deprivation doesn't help their seizures, but that trigger in itself does not, or that in itself does not cause this person to have a seizure. On the other hand, let's say this person did some documentation and they are finding that every single time they have had or they have been sleep deprived, or most of the time that they've been sleep deprived, that they have had a seizure, then that might be an indication that they may be having seizures. All right, seizures associated with that trigger. Okay, so some additional considerations that we want to keep in mind are seizure patterns. Seizures during sleep, you want to make sure that you have a really good plan around individuals when they're having seizures during sleep, because this can be a time that it's dangerous to have a seizure. So if a person can get their hands on a seizure alert monitor, that can let another person know that, hey, this person's heart rate or their movement looks like they're having a seizure, maybe you want to go check on them. For some people, they may just have somebody always, sleeping in the same room with them and checking on them in a consistent manner. Other people may have seizure assist dogs that can alert people when they notice that this person is having a seizure. You want to plan around sleep deprivation. Figure out ways that you do not have to deprive yourself of sleep. Plan ahead, or see if you can get accommodations at work or school that can allow for you to get the adequate amount of sleep that you need. Medication schedules are important to keep track of. And then any changes in your diet or fluid are also things that you want to think about, because those changes in itself can be a trigger. But for some people, maybe they're just not eating well. Maybe they're not eating right. That can be something that can impact your seizure threshold for sure. We want to be taking care of ourselves. Traveling and going on vacation, though a lot of us probably aren't right now, can also be a stressful situation. And I'll be going over traveling in the next slide or so. Sensitivity to lights or other stimulus should be considered before making plans at certain locations. And then if you have other illnesses or medicines, you do want to consult your doctor to make sure that they won't affect your seizure control. Traveling can be very stressful, and as I talked about before, stress in itself can be a seizure trigger. So take rests and breaks as you can when you are traveling, or maybe you are going to the airport. To be able to accommodate this, maybe you want to get to the airport just a bit early so that you have the time to take breaks if you need to, and you can be in a less stressful mood. Proactively solve problems to avoid unneeded stress during your trip. So maybe you remember the last time you went on a trip that you were very, very tired and that affected you. Perhaps you'll go to sleep at a more reasonable time this time, or maybe you haven't had a problem in the past, but you can think of something that could happen. Then proactively solve those issues ahead of time so that you don't have that unneeded stress during that traveling. Use others as a support system. If you are traveling with other people, they can help you with remembering to take your medication or maybe help you with your bags, those small things to limit that stress. Pay attention to time zone changes because you want to make sure that you're taking your medications at the correct time. And if you are traveling with children, you may want to travel with another adult. So we have some tips and tools that you can use. Overall wellness is important to maintain seizure control. Definitely take care of yourself. There are some wellness tools that you can take advantage of. We have the Wellness Institute that's provided by the Epilepsy Foundation National, and these links are going to be in the PowerPoint that I will send in the follow-up email. Or you can use the American Epilepsy Society's database tool to find a doctor in your area.
Hi, I'm Greg Grunberg, actor, epilepsy advocate, father of a young adult with epilepsy. I'd like to take the next couple of minutes to talk to you about wellness. Wellness means having a healthy mind, body, and healthy feelings, resulting in an overall sense of well-being. Making health a priority is essential to a happy and full life. Wellness is important for all of us, but even more so for people with epilepsy. Did you know that 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their life? A chronic health condition like epilepsy and its treatments can affect your health, well-being, and your daily life. If you live with epilepsy, improving aspects of your wellness may help with brain health and seizure control. Sometimes what you eat, not getting enough sleep, how you manage your stress, and other factors can affect your seizures, so it's important to pay attention to your daily habits and lifestyle.
All right, and so this video clip was actually from the Epilepsy Foundation National's Wellness Institute website. So definitely if you want to learn more or want some more tips, please reach out or feel free to go out to that website because there are a lot of useful tools around wellness. And then we have our information services here at the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota. So we have free one-on-one support, customized tools and resources, a variety of epilepsy-related topics can be covered, and you can also request materials. So that is going to be going through our wonderful Senior Coordinator of Information Services, Debbie Leone. Her email is dleone@efmn.org, or you can call her at 651-287-2303. And I'm actually getting to the end of our presentation here. So as I'm going through these next slides, please feel free to enter your question in that your questions in that question and answer area, and I will get to that at the end of the presentation here. EFMN's mission is that we lead the fight to overcome challenges of living with epilepsy and to accelerate therapies to stop seizures, find cures, and save lives. If you want to learn more about Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota in general, please visit www.efmn.org, or you can call our general line at 1-800-779-0777. And we also take donations, and donations can be made at the website referenced here. And then before I get to questions, I do want to also just note that, my name is Jamila Pickett. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Education. And if you wanted to contact me for any of the reasons that I mentioned previously as well, please feel free to email me. I'll get back to you within 3 business days. Or if you call me, please leave a voicemail. My email is jpickett@efmn.org, or you can call me at 651-287-2315. EFMN is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And in the follow-up email, I will be including an evaluation that would be wonderful if you could just fill that out and put that in for us. And then please consider donating. We do provide almost all of our trainings and education services such as this webinar for free, but that's because we do have wonderful people who donate to the foundation, and you can find it at that link there as well. And then these are our references that will be included in your follow-up email. But I do want to get to any questions if there are any. So please feel free. I'll give people time here to enter in their questions as needed, and I will answer those. So let me give people a second here. All right, I have one question. Let me just... Okay. So is it necessary or possible for a seizure trigger to be verified by a medical professional? Necessary would be case by case, definitely, because your physician may really need to figure out that trigger, whereas somebody else maybe has individually figured out that they have a trigger and they are able to kind of manage that themselves. As far as if it's possible, there are some triggers that it is possible to see if somebody has a seizure trigger to that. And the reason why we know that only 3% of the population of people with epilepsy has a photosensitivity trigger is because there is a test that they commonly do with people who have epilepsy to see if they have that trigger. It's probably more intricate than this, but they kind of like shine a light or light similar to what could cause somebody to have that trigger. And they look in their brain to see what kind of activity is happening in their brain to kind of see if that is a trigger for them. There are some triggers though that people cannot, that we cannot test. Things like stress, that's not necessarily that you can't, but it's really hard because it's not as tangible as some of the other triggers that we see. Please feel free to continue to put in your questions. There's another question about, can a person's seizure threshold be lowered? Yes, a person's seizure threshold can. So our seizure threshold is determined by our parents in some way, so by heredity, but not fully. And so we have that, and you'll have your seizure threshold level from that and some other reasons. But also, there are some medications that can lower a person's seizure threshold. There's some activities and behaviors that people can be a part of that can lower a person's seizure threshold. So it is not set in stone. A person can have their seizure threshold lower or even increase, maybe even with wellness and things like that. All right, please feel free to continue to log in any questions. We have one more minute here, so I just want to be respectful of people's time, but I also want to take any questions if there are any more. I'm going to leave us on this screen here. This is my information, my contact information screen, just in case people want to reach out. Please give me a few days for you to get your follow-up email with the information and handouts that I'll be sending you. But if you do not receive it this week, please contact me because you should be receiving it this week. If there were any questions that I didn't answer, or you maybe just wanted to ask more one-on-one, please feel free to contact me with the contact information that is on the screen here, and I will get back to you with an email or a call depending on what your preference is. But it is 1 o'clock and it looks like I got through all of the questions. So I would like to say thank you so much for attending this presentation, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day.